pre-lecture for Unit 1, Module 2 covers objectives 1.2a, b, and c. So we're going to be briefly defining micro and macro evolution. For our purposes, for now we're going to define microevolution as a change in allele frequencies in a population over time. And we will use the example of the peppered moth to define microevolution. So in this image we have two different forms of the peppered moth. There's the dark form and a lighter speckled form. Now on this particular tree trunk, the tree trunk is dark, and so the dark moth blends in very well, and the lighter colored speckled moth stands out, and so it's more likely to be eaten by predatory birds. And over time, we would expect in this population to see an increase in the frequency of alleles that code for the dark colored moth. Because these dark colored moths, by blending in and being camouflaged on the tree trunk, they're less likely to be eaten by predatory birds, so they'll have a longer lifespan and a greater chance of reproductive success. That particular example that we just looked at with the peppered moths is an example of evolution by natural selection. So natural selection is one mechanism for microevolution. There are other mechanisms that we will also learn about, including genetic drift and gene flow. So evolution by natural selection is just one of many mechanisms by which microevolution can occur. And for evolution by natural selection to occur, all of these following statements must be true. And we can use the peppered moth example to look at each one of these. So there has to be some variation in a population amongst individuals. They could vary in their morphology, which is what we see with the peppered moths. There were some that are speckled and some that are darker colored, so their form is different. You could also have variation in physiology or behavior as well. There's competition for resources. We talked about competition in semester 1 when we looked at ecosystems and communities and populations. And so these moths are going to be competing with one another for space, for breeding partners, food, etc. The selective force in this particular case in the environment that acts on these individuals would be the predatory birds. They're going to swoop down and they're going to pick off the moths that are more readily visible. Those that survive possess the best adaptations. In the image that we just saw, the dark moth would be the one that has the adaptive trait because it's able to camouflage and blend in. Because the coloration of the moth is coded for by different versions of genes, remember those are called alleles, we would say that this adaptation is heritable. So dark moths mating with other dark moths are going to have more dark moths. And over time, if we monitor that population over time on the darker colored tree trunks, we would see a change in the frequency of the dark allele in that population. And we would see it increase while the peppered allele would decrease over time. But that is in that particular scenario when those tree trunks were dark. One thing that I did not mention in that previous list is that we have to really consider the environment as well when we're looking at evolution by natural selection. So here we've got a graph of the allele frequency for a gene that codes for an enzyme called lactase dehydrogenase, and it's just called LDH for short. And this is the B form. and there is the superscript B form. There's also a superscript A form. So there's the B and the A form of the lactate dehydrogenase alleles. And the B form works very well at colder temperatures. So if we look at a population of killfish, this is the common killfish. Its genus name is Fundus. In the killfish populations that live in colder environments, we see a much higher allele frequency for the LDB B form. And as we go towards warmer temperatures, the frequency of that LDHBB form decreases over time. And so these killfish that live in the warmer environments, say off the coast of Georgia, they're going to have a higher frequency of the LDHB A form. So that would be high, whereas the LDHB B form would be low because it really works much better at colder temperatures. If you go back and think about the example with the moths, we can also apply this concept of the environment's role in evolution by natural selection. The picture that you were shown on the first slide would be indicative of trees after the Industrial Revolution. And with the Industrial Revolution, pollution really impacted the growth of lichens on trees. And so when lichens don't grow on trees, you tend to see the dark colored bark. Before the Industrial Revolution, lichens grew extremely well on the tree trunks and branches. And so the tree trunks would have had that kind of light whitish green color to them from the lichens. So before the Industrial Revolution, the adaptive trait for the moths would have actually been the peppered form, because it being light, it would have blended in with the tree trunks much better. So what we consider to be adaptive really depends on where we are. So what environment is that population in? The LDHBB form is very adaptive in cold water, not very adaptive in warm water. So we do have to pay attention to the environment. For evolution by natural selection to occur, the very first requirement that was listed on the slide earlier was there has to be some kind of variation within the population. Could be form, could be physiology, behavior, but there has to be some type of variation. And we know from semester 1 that one of the best ways to increase genetic diversity in a population is through the process of sexual reproduction. Because with sexual reproduction, we've got events that occur during meiosis, so during the production of gametes, such as crossing over and independent assortment, that produce new combinations of alleles and gametes. So producing gametes in itself increases genetic diversity, and then the fertilization process is completely random. So for sexual reproducing populations, we're going to have a higher amount of genetic diversity. Now, in terms of the ultimate source though, how do we get these new alleles? You cannot get new alleles without a mutation. So in that population of moths, we wouldn't have a speckled form and a form that was dark in color if there weren't a mutation. So sexual reproduction can alter the combinations of alleles and increase genetic diversity within a population, but ultimately you do have to have a mutation in order to get a new allele. Now in semester 1, for the most part, when we talked about mutations, it was in a very negative context. So we saw examples of mutations that cause disease, for example. So they were mutations that could be lethal or just cause reduced fitness for the organism. They could be neutral. Some mutations, we saw examples of silent mutations. They don't really have any impact at all on the protein product that is made. And in some cases, mutations can actually be adaptive. So in other words, they have a positive impact on their survival of that organism. And over time, a population will change in a way that adaptive alleles increase in frequency. And so through that process of natural selection, adaptive alleles become more frequent in a population over time.